Rain of stones reported. It was reliably reported by several persons that a rain of stones fell from a clear blue sky on Carlin Street in the town of Chamberlain on August 17th. The stones fell principally on the home of Mrs. Margaret White, damaging the roof extensively and ruining 2 gutters and a downspout valued at approximately $25. Mrs. White, a widow, lives with her 3-year-old daughter, Carrie. Mrs. White could not be reached for comment. Today is April 5th, 2024, and today Carrie turns 50. Not the character. The character Carrie was born in September 21st, 1963. Carrie, the character, would be 61 years old. No, Carrie, the book, turns 50 years old today. And since publishing this book, Stephen King has carried on, to sell more books than God himself. Now, this is the first in a multi-part series as we journey part by part through Carrie. We will end this series with a review and then a darkest detail video for the book of Carrie. This video will contain a So What Happened portion, a literary analysis portion, a writer's corner where we talk about some of the writer's tips that we can pick up from the part 1 in the Carrie phenomenon, a book that is now 50 years old, and we will end this video with an Adrian's corner. So, what happened? We meet Carrietta White, a girl, or a young woman now, whose father is dead and whose mother is religious. Oppressively religious, so religious in a weird way that she never bothered to tell Carrie about the birds and the bees, or even about the biological processes like having her first period. And that's where we find Carrie, starting for the first time after gym class. Of course, she's convinced she's dying. Luckily, her classmates, like all teenage girls everywhere seeing their classmate in need, choose to console her by throwing FemHi products at her and chanting period, period. Carrie is sent home from school. Later, Sue Snell and her boyfriend hubba hubba a few times in the back seat, and he convinces her she should apologize. Kind of. Then Carrie's mom gets home, and to help ease her daughter's mind, she beat the snot out of Carrie and locks her in the prayer closet. Eventually, she gets let out, and they work on some sewing together before Carrie goes to bed. But before she leaves the room, Carrie clears the thread from the machine with her mind powers to scare her mother. One of the girls, by the way, from the locker room situation who is not going to apologize to Carrie is Christine Hargensen, like, just the main mean girl. Christine is so unapologetic that she refuses to even serve her punishment for the locker room stuff, which gets her a 3-day suspension and her prom tickets revoked. Sue Snell then convinces her boyfriend to take Carrie to prom. He's super popular and everyone loves him, and it would not be ultra obvious that something weird was up at all, so he agrees to do it. Later, Carrie tells her mom that a boy had asked her to prom, and Carrie's mother lovingly lets her know that she is a sinner and evil and tells her to get back in the closet. Carrie, however, has other ideas. Then, Christine is obviously up to shenanigans at the prom preparations and sends her boyfriends and some of his goons to harvest blood. From a literary analysis perspective, really, there are 6 things that I wanted to talk about here, and I think it all has to start with colors and substances. Blood versus water, and red versus white. Keep your eye on every time you see the color red in this novel, every time you see the color white in this novel, every time that we're dealing with blood, every time that we're dealing with water. Blood, red, white, water. Blood is supposedly dirty and sinful. In this novel, you look at things like the period blood. That is where all of the problems in this novel start. The pig's blood, which is where all of the problems in book one of this, or part one of this book end, and where they will begin a little bit later. All of the blood that results from Mama's beatings. Now, all of those things are red, just like, remember, when we get the sort of strange, dreamlike sequence of Mama defeating the devil and he runs away on the street, and the sparks that fly up from his hooves are red. Also, the sinful dress that Carrie wants to wear to prom is red. But there is also blood of righteousness. Jesus died for your sins, don't you know? Remember, we don't just have crosses all over the place in Carrie's house, in Margaret's house, I guess I should say. We have crucifixes. Crucifixes being the actual scene of Jesus on the cross. Those, well, they can be pretty bloody. You wouldn't say that Jesus' blood is sinful, would you? Now, what about white? The color white and water. These things are pure. These things are clean. Or at least they're supposed to be. Water cleanses, right? But it is in the showers that Carrie starts her period. They are at church camp. Carrie is at church camp, but she had better not go swimming. She has to sneak her bikini with her. And that harlot of a neighbor, remember the neighbor who was in the bikini outside in her yard that started the fight with young Carrie? The fight with young Carrie that resulted in all of those stones raining down? She was wearing a white bikini. Also, Mama's last name is White. Carrie's last name is White. So there's a quote here from page 46 of the novel. Well, at least my standard print edition of the novel. She turned and walked heavily up the stairs. The bathroom had a wooden floor that had been scrubbed nearly white. Cleanliness is next to godliness. And a tub on claw feet. Rust stains dripped down the porcelain below the chrome spout, and there was no shower attachment. Mama said showers were sinful. So even in the idea of cleaning, there can be sinful things. But even in this place, the bathtub, in the bathroom, the floors are nearly white. They're not white. In the bathtub, the very spout from which the water comes, that cleansing water, it's got rust on it. What color is rust? Kind of orange, but kind of red. So we have all of these mixtures of things. White that can be pure, but white that can be tempting. Blood that can be dirty and nasty. Period blood, a hog's blood. Or it could be the blood of Christ that cleanses you. Blood, by the way, is thicker than water. We have in this novel Carrie choosing her social life over her mother. All of these general ideas at play, which are from really classical types of symbology, white and water and purity, blood and red and family, blood and impurity, blood and suffering. It's in this novel that we get a little bit of the blood being impure, right? So that's sort of one of the things that this novel is doing in its own way, but it's not all that strange. I mean, the idea of blood itself, certainly in the later 1900s would take on a different connotation maybe than when this novel was published in 74. Blood being a place where disease is transmuted, but we do have disease being transmitted through blood being referenced in this section of the novel as well. But keep an eye open for the colors of white, for water, and the ideas of purity moving forward. Keep your eyes open for red, the idea of sin, and the idea of impurity moving forward. The next thing that I think is worth talking about a little bit here, on pages 44 and 45, we have all of these scenes that are in the prayer closet, right? There were many religious pictures, but one Carrie liked the best was on the wall above her chair. It was Jesus leading lambs on a hill that was green and smooth as the riverside golf course. The others were not as tranquil. Jesus and the money changers from the temple, Moses throwing the tablets down upon the worshippers of the golden calf. Golden calf, by the way, we get a calf slaughtered later. Thomas, the doubter, putting his hand in Christ's wounded side, an open wound. And obviously, if you think about the connotations of a finger going into an open wound, oh, the horrified fascination of that one, and the nightmares it had given her as a girl. Noah's Ark floating above the agonized, drowning sinners. Lot and his family fleeing the great burning of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife, by the way, looked back and was turned into what? Salt. What color is salt? Not pink, it's white. On a small table there was a lamp and a stack of tracts. The top pamphlet showed a sinner. His spiritual status was obvious from the agonized expression on his face, trying to crawl beneath a large boulder. That the title blared, "Neither shall the rock hide him on that day." The rock hide him, like the rocks that Carrie makes rain from the sky. So these things are interesting too. All of these scenes that are in her, all of the scenes that are in her prayer closet are well, besides the first one that she talks about, are scenes of destruction and devastation, not of a smiling God. No. Of the God that will bring wrath upon sinners. So there is that much to be looked forward to as well. Now, on 44 as well, this is interesting. This is maybe not a literary analysis idea here, but certainly something that can help add to enjoyment in this novel. We have all of these ideas of the maternal here, right? Well, Stephen King didn't know his father, or at least I don't think knew his father. Stephen King grew up without a father, grew up with just his mother. In fact, let me read you this paragraph. Mama worked on the speed ironer and folder down at the Blue Ribbon Laundry in Chamberlain Center. She had worked there since Carrie was 5, when the compensation and insurance that had resulted from her father's accident had begun to run out. Her hours were from 7:30 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. The laundry was godless. Stephen King's mother, who raised him, spent some time working in an industrial laundry. I think it's on Writing where he talks about this. So it's just interesting to see a writer's real life maybe have shadows in here. Also, we have the setting here of a high school. Stephen King wrote this while he was a high school teacher. Now, that makes it more than a little bit weird the way he's describing some of these girls. But if you're reading the novel alongside me, you understand what I'm talking about. But the next thing that I want to talk about is something that we We don't get a whole lot. We don't even get a whole lot in um, science fiction. Most of the places in popular culture, I would wager to bet that we get something like telekinesis are movies and comic books. Professor X, anyone? But we get this here on 92, quote, she opened her eyes and looked at the hairbrush on her bureau. Flex. She was lifting the hairbrush. It was heavy. It was like lifting a barbell with very weak arms. Oh, grunt. The hairbrush slid to the side of the bureau, slid out past the point where gravity should have toppled it, and then dangled as if on an invisible string. Carrie's eyes had closed to slits. Veins pulsed in her temples. A doctor might have been interested in what her body was doing at that instant. It made no rational sense. Respiration had fallen to 16 breaths per minute. Blood pressure was up to 190 over 100. Heartbeat up to 140, higher than an astronaut's under the heavy G load of liftoff. Temperature was down to 94.3 degrees. Her body was burning energy that seemed to be coming from nowhere and seemed to be going nowhere. An electrocephalogram would have shown alpha waves that were no longer waves at all, but great jagged spikes. End quote. We have a discussion of the process of telekinesis. This is something that Stephen King is actually he's really good at this sort of thing, explaining the paranormal, explaining the phenomenon in his writing, giving you at least enough explanation that things make sense, right? So he goes into, we'll get into this in the next point, but he goes into a little bit more detail with some things. This is not super scientific. Certainly this would pass for more scientific than Kurt Vonnegut's writings, and Kurt Vonnegut is known as a science fiction writer. Now, Kurt Vonnegut is a soft sci-fi writer. He's not going into the Michael Crichton nuts and bolts of the science involved. He just mentions ideas, basically. What Stephen King is doing here is somewhere in between the two. This is not quite fantasy. This is not quite science fiction. It's still in the literature sort of storytelling genre of things. I wouldn't even say that at this point this novel is really horror. We have certainly the horrific elements of Carrie's house, right? All of the things that go on in there, but nothing to this point is particularly in the horror genre, and maybe this is something that I should have talked about in the writer's corner portion of this, but it's interesting that, look, this is Stephen King's first novel. He started this as a short story, and he wanted to publish it in a magazine and ended up throwing it away a couple times. And his wife dug it out of the trash can, wiped the cigarette butts off of it, and said, "What are you doing? You got to keep going with this." But this section with the telekinesis and the heredity of telekinesis that is interesting to read. I think it's very well done by Stephen King, and it's a type of writing that keeps things moving, but uh, does not necessarily come across as either too little detail or too much, right? There's times with Michael Crichton where you're reading and you're like, hey man, I don't care, get back to the dinosaurs. This is not that. And we have a little further with the idea of telekinesis on page 120, a very nice explanation for what is going on in this novel. It is now generally agreed that the TK phenomenon is a genetic recessive occurrence, but the opposite of a disease like hemophilia. What is hemophilia? A disease of the blood, which becomes overt only in males. In that disease, once called King's Evil, the gene. So this novel could have been called Queen's Evil, right? The gene is recessive in the female and carried harmlessly. Male offspring, however, are bleeders. We have blood. The disease is generated only if afflicted males marry a woman carrying the recessive gene. If the offspring of such a union is a male, the result will be a hemophiliac son. If the offspring is female, the result will be a daughter who is a carrier. It should be emphasized that the hemophilia gene may be carried recessively in the male as a part of his genetic makeup. But if he marries a woman with the same outlaw gene, the result will be hemophilia if the offspring is male. In the case of royal families where intermarriage was common, the chances of the gene reproducing once it is entered the family tree were high, thus the name King's Evil. Hemophilia also showed up in significant quantities in Appalachia during the earlier part of this century. It is commonly noticed in those cultures where incest and marriage of the first cousins is common. That's a little bit of a jab that I don't know if Stephen King necessarily had to throw in there, but he is a nor'easter, so he probably felt that it was necessary. With the TK phenomenon, the male appears to be the carrier. The TK gene may be recessive in the female, but dominates only in the female. It appears that Ralph White carried the gene. Margaret Brigham, by purest chance, also carried the outlaw gene sign, but we may be fairly confident that it was recessive, as no information has ever been found to indicate that she had telekinetic powers resembling her daughter's. Investigations are now being conducted into the life of Margaret Brigham's grandmother, Sadie Cochran, for if the dominant recessive pattern obtains with TK, as it does with hemophilia, Mrs. Cochran may have been TK dominant. So we have here from Stephen King the idea that Margaret's mother was likely a telekinetic as well. Interesting things to note from Stephen King here, and all of these ideas. So here's one thing that Stephen King does not any longer get credit for. He's a good writer, and even thematically, he's a good writer with... Look, you have a character who is making a big deal out of starting her period. Or not making a big deal out of it, but that's the inciting event for this novel. That's a big moment in her life. It has to do with blood. If telekinesis is a heritable thing, thematically, you would explain it using the hereditary notes, if you will, of a blood disease like hemophilia. He used to tie things like this together all the time. Maybe I'm the one not giving him enough credit in the recent Stephen King books that I've read, but I don't see him doing this anymore. But he was very capable of it. The last thing that I want to talk about with the literary analysis portion of this novel is Harry Potter. Now, I knew that Stephen King was a fan of J.K. Rowling. I did not know that it seems J.K. Rowling may have been a fan of Stephen King. When we find young Harry Potter, where is he? The beginning of every book. He's locked in a closet under the stairs by the Dursleys. Where do we find Carrie oftentimes? Locked in a closet. Why is Carrie locked in the closet? For being a sinful witch. Why was Harry Potter locked in the closet? For being a wizard that drew attention. There's also I had on 132. I don't know if you caught this. They're talking about the farm they're going to harvest the blood. Red Trelawney was old man Henry's hired hand. I had never heard the name Trelawney until I had to read Harry Potter. It turns out I had, because I had read Carrie before I had read Harry Potter. But that Trelawney is not a common name. So maybe it was plucked out of this by one J.K. Rowling as well. From the writer's corner, I think that there are four things worth talking about here. And one of them, I think, is easy to overlook in today's world. And I don't mean anything culturally, I don't mean anything about. I don't know what I might mean something with that by, but listen, we have all of these citations running through this novel. From the shadow exploded, this is on page 6, pardon me. From the shadow exploded, documented facts and specific conclusions derived from the case of Carrietta White by David R. Congress, Tulane University Press, 1981, page 34. Did you catch it? Did you catch that? We are here with this book celebrating because this is the 50th anniversary of Carrie, meaning that Carrie was published in 1974. And we have here a citation from a text in 1981. This novel is written sort of in the future tense. Why would we want to do so? Maybe this is just my readership that has completely been completely disabused of novels that take place in the near future. Now, obviously, everyone knows about, science fiction and fantasy novels that take place in the far set future, but here we have a novel taking place or being comprised of texts, perhaps, that are about 7 years in the future. Nothing crazy from a standpoint in 1974, but still not in the day. So, in my experiences, there's not a whole lot of near future set stuffs. Why would this be set in the near future? Well, because it is a phenomenological type of event. It's not something dependent on far-flung technology, but it is something that we have no proof of right now. So you wouldn't want to set a book about something like this in the near past. We would have heard about it in the news. You don't really want to set something like this in the present day, although really what we're talking about is sort of in the present day. The live events in the novel are present day. It's just, this is just something interesting to note, that there is a reason to to have something take place, perhaps. Maybe not set something. All of our sort of all of our text that happens in real time is sort of concurrent to the day when the novel was published. But now I want to talk about something that you can notice very early in this novel. What is this novel? What is the inciting event here? The inciting event is a girl starting her first period. A girl who is coming into womanhood, right? But don't forget the words that I used there, because the very next paragraph after we break from the event that had happened, the inciting event in Carrie's story in this novel, when the girls were gone to their period 2 classes. That's not an accident. Stephen King knew exactly what he was doing with that word choice. Stephen King was using the words period 2 very, very consciously. And he doesn't stop there with the puns. And this is a little bit, so this is the one I'm going to use right now, is not all that nice. Now, Miss Desjardins said, so Miss Desjardins is showing Carrie how to use the sanitary napkins that are kept in the coin machine on the wall. Now, Miss Desjardins said with hissing, deadly emphasis, you take one of those napkins out. No, never mind the coin slot, it's broken anyway. What is the coin slot? How would it be broken? The coin slot would be here a euphemism for the woman part being broken, bleeding. So we have all of these little areas where Stephen King is just throwing around puns, and he doesn't stop just then. Due to Miss White's near fanatical fundamentalist religious beliefs, this is on page 15, Mrs. White had no friends to see her through her period of bereavement. On 18, 2 detention periods, Morton snapped. A blood blister was forming under his thumbnail. A blood blister. And look, I've got like 20 of these little puns written down here. Miss Desjardins chuckled unhappily. I got them the hell out of there. I was too flustered, and Carrie was having hysterics. If you don't know where the word hysterics comes from, you will be able to find a feminist text within arm's length of any college campus that you're on that will tell you where that word comes from. She had tried to fit. She had defied Mama in 100 little ways, had tried to erase the Red Plague. Carrie's eyes were red. So there's all of these little areas where Stephen King is having fun in this novel. Now, they're not grandiose, I'm making myself laugh, Kurt Vonnegut type moments, but they're little things that if you're just not paying attention, you would miss the dirty sort of dirty old man humor that Stephen King is throwing in here on a euphemism level just for fun. Broken coin slot, right? So it is interesting to me to see Stephen King in that fashion. Stephen King's work in later years, in my opinion, has lost a great deal of that fun, has lost a great deal of that experimentation, has lost a great deal if you really want to get into it, from a writer's perspective, what you're doing there is you're trusting your audience. If they don't get it, they don't get it. But you kind of think they will. Stephen King no longer trusts his audience, in my opinion. Stephen King in Holly, Stephen King in Fairy Tale, and I'm not doing this just to rag on Stephen King. What I'm saying is, don't let your writing lose its personality. Stephen King in those later novels that I have read from him is sort of just giving everything to the reader that he thinks the reader wants or that he wants the reader to have. He is not making things on the page in a coy fashion. So there is another one here. On page 33, and this is an interesting one because maybe I have become maybe I've gotten away from it, right? Maybe I have read too much into this text so far. We have Carrie approaching her neighbor who is in the naughty white bikini. And Carrie is looking at her and asking her, what's on your chest, things like that. This girl, her name is Stella Horan. Stellar whoring? Stellar whoring? Right? What are we doing there, Stephen? You're having fun on the page, at least. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. The next thing I want to talk about. This novel is a little bit confusing from a psychic distance perspective. Now, psychic distance, how close is our narrative to our characters? How close are we in their heads? We have an often used Stephen King trope of the parenthetical statements that are direct thoughts from our characters. On page 27, taking part in a naked ritual that was shameful and embarrassing in her hopes that the circle around her might fade a little, just a little, parenthetical statement. But today, oh, today, that is her worrying, right? We get those little moments. But on the kissing page to this 26, we have Carrie on her way home. She had tried to fit. She had defied Mama in 100 little ways, had tried to erase the red plague circle that had been drawn around her from the first day that she left the controlled environment of the small house on Carlin Street and walked up to Barker Street Grammar School with her Bible under her arm. She could still remember that day, the stairs, and the sudden awful silence when she had gotten down on her knees before lunch in that school cafeteria. The laughter had begun on that day and had echoed up through the years. That is a very distant psychic distance. We are being told all of these things from our narrator on high. All of that stuff is out here being beamed to us, the reader, while the character is way out here. That is not we're not in the head of the character there, but we do travel back and forth very close in psychic distance to some of our characters. Now, I don't say this as a criticism necessarily. I don't say this to take anything from this novel, because Stephen King does it all very smoothly, and we don't question it when it's happening, I don't think. But it is something that, as a writer, we have to make that decision. Are we in our characters' heads or not? Are we the narrator using their language or not? These questions of distance have to be made, because it's very easy to flip back and forth and do it poorly. Stephen King does it very well here. The moment he did this in a clunky fashion, you would feel it as a reader. You would be suddenly jarred out of the text. And the last thing on a writer's corner perspective here, this whole novel so far feels very effortless, perhaps too effortless. Why do I say that? Why would it be too effortless? Well, we have something here, and I'll get back to this in the review in a few weeks here. We have at least a partially epistolary novel, a novel that is written in parts in letters. Well, it's not letters, it's textbooks and articles, newspaper articles, and things like that, but still partially written in letters, partially written as interviews. But you don't really feel the difference between those moments. This is something that Michael Crichton, in my opinion, does very well. Michael Crichton starts off a lot of his novels, and I hate to keep bringing up the same author here, but maybe it's just on the top of my mind. Michael Crichton starts a lot of his novels with like a press release or a research paper. But they are press releases and research papers, not written like the novel. All of the everything here is written sort of in the same voice, is what I'm saying. A little bit it's different, but really it's not. So there is that from this novel as well. I think that the barriers between the letter parts of this novel, the barriers between the textbook and the interviews and the just plain story parts of this novel could have been a little bit more well defined, but maybe that would have been too stultifying for a reader. One thing that I have always found fascinating about this text is that it's not a feminist text. It's not a feminist book, in that it is not written to pursue any type of agenda that might be described as feminist. But it is a very feminine text. I don't know that I would necessarily say that the narrator is effeminate, that the narrator is telling a story in an effeminate fashion. In fact, when you want to examine the male gaze in this novel, it's going to smack you in the face, is what it's going to do. Especially when you look at the dynamics between the characters here. But it is a text very much about women and dealing with. I mean, look, it's the first story I've ever read about period blood. There was a moment when I was in grad school where I had a part in one of my stories where I mentioned a part of the anatomy. It was a story about boys who were stealing pornography from the local bookstore, right? And someone was describing an anus, and it was used the quote, "It was the first anus I had ever seen. It looked like the end of a balloon that had been tied," something like that, right? My professor at the time, who was a woman, said it didn't make sense. In front of everyone, said that doesn't make sense. So I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean. It doesn't make sense. She said everyone has seen an anus. Duh. Right? Really sort of calling me out, making it sound like, what are you talking about? This isn't the first anus that kid had seen. But, which is a very strange phrase in the first place, but I had no idea what she was hinting at. And she said, didn't you used to take a mirror and examine your parts? I'm sorry, no. No. That has never happened to this day in my life. I didn't know. Apparently, that is a female thing. Women do that. They are taught how to, or at least at one point in some form, some fashion, somewhere, it was a fairly common thing. I don't know how common it really is. But that was two different worlds colliding, and it was basically, it was not a cultural thing, it was a gender thing. Here is something in this text that I think is interesting and worth thinking about. And I haven't read this text in almost a decade, so I don't know if there's any conclusion to be made from this. But even if there's not a final conclusion to be made, this is an interesting thing to find in a text that is so focused on women. In the part where the Stella is grown and being interviewed on the day that stones rained down on Carrie's house, the day that Carrie came and found her in that bikini, she's talking about how upset her mother got when Carrie was dragged away by her crazy mother. She says, and my mother and I looked at each other. I never saw Mom look so bad, not even when Dad died. And that was kind of a weird thing, right? Kind of a weird thing to be pointed out in the text. This random character who lives next door doesn't have a father. This random character who lives next door had lost her father. And we are left to believe, just kind of by the consequence of the novel, that that was early on, that it was before that she had lost her father before this event with Carrie. Then we read a little bit later that Carrie's, or no, maybe it's earlier, that Carrie's father had died of a heart attack, right? So Carrie, here she is in high school. So Stella, at the time of this event, I believe would have been probably around a high schooler. Her father had died. Carrie, at the time of this novel, Carrie's father died, I think it says before she was even born, right? And then we get this. Margaret's father, John Brigham, was killed in a barroom shooting incident in the summer of 1959. all the dads in this novel, they're not gone. They haven't left town. They haven't left the family. They didn't go to get milk and not return. They're dead. They are dead. The only father we have is Christine's father. That's the only father I can think of through part one of this novel that we've met is Christine's father, and he's not a particularly pleasing father, right? So we have in a novel that is so the end of this novel is going to have to do with the prom king and queen, right? And we already have the argument from the narrator tells us that the feminists in the school are trying to get rid of the designation of prom king and queen. We have this idea of the king's evil, which is a blood disease that passes down through hereditary fashion and kills males. Now we have this idea of the in a female based text, the idea of a female hereditary disease dealing with blood could be called the queen's evil if we wanted to really go down that route. And this is a novel that has so much to do with God, the Father, and all of the fathers are dead, leaving the mothers through whom this gene of telekinesis passes. It's just, I'm not sure exactly what to do with it yet, but I think that it is interesting to observe.